I'm going to start the recording. Mike, I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry. Oh. There we go. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining us and for taking the time to share the story of how the City of London is advancing its climate lens in terms of within the departments, and also how that plays out in council reports and council discussions. So thank you so much for taking the time to provide updates on and lessons learned from the City of London.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here and present the work of my team. So I'll share a screen here, get this rolling, and just noting the other items that you had on the agenda today. I think my slides only run probably about 25-ish or so minutes. So there should be plenty of time for discussion afterwards, which is great.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so a little bit about what I'll hit over here. Genesis, so just sort of how this all came about for us in the City of London. Talk about the initial tools or our initial crack at how to satisfy the requirements. Then we'll give you some details on how it evolved into what we're now calling the climate lens process. And then a few examples of the process in use and sort of where we're going with it and what we can expect looking ahead. So Genesis, this is a common story in a lot of Canadian municipalities right now. Sort of early 2019, we had a climate emergency declaration passed by our council. And later on in that year, we put forward a sort of a mini strategy report that basically covered the next sort of 12 to 18 months of actions that we'd like to do in response to the climate emergency declaration. One of which was to create our climate emergency action plan, which is actually just coming out later this year. And then, of course, the item that we're going to discuss later on is this development of a what we had called initially a climate emergency evaluation tool. That has sort of since morphed into a climate emergency screening tool and a screening process, and I'll give you the evolution behind that in a moment. But some of the other key items from that initial report were that we were going to essentially convene a team of internal champions. In many respects, these folks within the corporation were already championing climate forward causes and decision making, but we wanted to create a spot for everybody to come together and tackle things as a unit. And then, of course, the big landmark piece from that original report was that London was committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So the initial tool, this really came out of a desire for us to take a snapshot analysis of the things that we were doing, things that we needed to start doing, the things we needed to stop doing, and the things that we needed to change. So that was sort of the original framing. And the way we tackled this was that first and foremost, at the onset, we wanted everybody to understand that it was not meant to be a go, no-go tool, but it was actually meant to be something to support decision making. We also wanted to make sure that people understood it wasn't going to be all encompassing. It wasn't meant to be a detailed life cycle assessment of every possible thing we were doing, but really the idea was that we take a generic approach and bring forward all the issues around climate change, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side, onto the decision-making table, really to look at greenhouse gas emissions, both primary and secondary, embedded carbon as well, and then, of course, some of the issues around adaptation that are specific to London, looking at natural heritage health and protection, and resilience to some of the other impacts that we're seeing. So the original tool was created, again, just as a generic tool that we thought we could apply to pretty much everything. We had divided it up into mitigation and adaptation questions, about 6 of each. And there was a little bit of crossover there, but the idea was that we wanted to get this out, test it, see how it landed, and see if it was actually generating some good discussion and help for the decision-making process. So we took that original tool. We had a few different test groups that we went to. Our entire city planning group got together and workshopped it one day, tried to actually use the tool to evaluate secondary plans, some different bylaws, and some master planning activities that were coming up, as well as our community improvement plans. Then we also went to that group that was just convened, the Climate Emergency Action Team. So that was a good cross-section of folks from across the corporation, various different service areas, to have them sort of think about a current project that they were working on and try to apply the tool and see what we could learn from that. And then also we went straight to our transportation planning and design division. And this was one of the groups that was actually earmarked in our original November 2019 report to apply the screening tool to current transportation projects. So we knew that they would be one of the early or the earliest users of the tool. So we wanted to get some immediate feedback from them and help design something that was going to suit their purposes. And we also went external. Gabby was kind enough to provide us some review comments early on. on behalf of the Clean Air Partnership. And as well, we spoke with Dr. Kirby Calvert from CCAP, Community Energy Knowledge and Action Partnership. So we had a good set of feedback from sort of that internal workshopping as well as some external input as well. And it highlighted a lot of issues. I think one of the first and foremost issues was that, when you try to create a tool that does something for everyone, it's very difficult that it does anything well for anyone. And also we identified too that across the corporation, there was quite often a lack of climate change understanding. So we started using terms that people weren't necessarily familiar with, or the concepts were not as familiar as they needed to be to have the in-depth discussion that the tool was really searching for. The applicability of the questions wasn't necessarily there for everyone, and that's pretty easy to understand, actually, if you try and have a conversation about reducing emissions with transportation engineers versus someone in social and health development. It's a bit of a different conversation. The specificity of language used sort of built off of that thought as well. The fact that direct greenhouse gas emissions in transportation is a much different conversation. You're using different language. So that was an issue. There was also a lot of questions about the existing processes that were in play in those different various service areas, and how this process would how this tool would get used or embedded in that process, or not at all. Was it a bolt-on at the end? It wasn't really clear to people when they first saw this thing, how it was supposed to be used. And then furthermore, the implementation expectations. So where or on what should this screening tool actually be used? Now, that November report that we put out did also stipulate that we wanted to see climate conversations show up in all staff reports. So that was sort of in the back of everyone's mind when they were seeing this, but it wasn't totally clear at what point of their processes or what the specific targets for application of this tool were. So with all of those learnings, we essentially realized we kind of had to roll up our sleeves as a team and take a step back on and reevaluate our approach. And that really evolved over time into what we've dubbed now this climate lens process. And I must say that throughout the development of this process, we had a few kernels of ideas and threads to pull to sort of get to a place where we were producing something of value for people throughout the corporation. But it was really only through these interactive sessions and workshops and one-on-one conversations that we had with people through development of specific tools that really got down to a process that appeared to work everywhere. So it was really a collaborative effort across the corporation to do this. So I mentioned we sort of rolled back a little bit our thinking, and we started to realize that if we wanted to provide something that was of value to everybody, it needed to be specific for those folks. So it started off, we went down to the different work areas within our service areas. There was about 22 distinct groups that we met with originally. There's a few outliers still, as we're still in the later implementation stages of this process. But so we went to the division manager or a similar position within the work area to have a one-on-one conversation with their leader, figure out where they were in terms of accommodating climate considerations in their decision-making already. Ultimately looking at how we can best frame this conversation when we go to a wider audience. So with that conversation, we drafted up a workshop, which actually started with a conversation about what is climate change, what does it mean globally, and what does it mean to us here in London? And then ultimately, what does it mean for the specific service area that we were talking to? So in that workshop, I'll chat a little bit more on the next slide about it, but we had some great conversations and ended up getting towards a draft document production stage. And this was primarily handled by the team that I'm a part of. So we basically put together a draft set of documentation and then had this iterative review process with those groups to make sure that what we're saying in the documentation, the targets for the analysis of this climate lens process were appropriate. And then also chatting about the accountability and sort of transparency on communication and reporting. Get it all on paper, make sure that the group that's actually going to be using it is familiar with what is there and is comfortable with what is there, and then shifting to implementation thereafter. So in those workshops, like I said, we kind of had our top educational piece where we looked at the community-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the corporate inventory, our risks and vulnerability assessments to talk about, what exactly climate change means to London, and then drilled that down into the specific service area aspects that needed to be accounted for. And then from there, we really got down into the nitty gritties and talking about what sort of tools or crib sheets or issues lists we could provide that would help them in their own workflow. And so we talked a little bit about master planning, operations, projects, and budgeting, and it was actually a very different conversation within each work area, which is understandable considering that it's very different to be a transportation or a water engineer delivering services to your municipality versus someone in that social and housing group. It's a very different conversation. So we had those conversations, and the intent was really to figure out how to generate something that's going to provide value, transparency, and accountability when it came to incorporating climate change into our decision making. So over time, we developed these 5 different streams that define the process in each different service area. The first 2, master planning guidelines and strategies, and the existing and new projects and programs, are definitely the most substantial. So these streams of activities, we wanted to provide tools that would help at these specific points in time where critical decisions are being made, whether it be at a policy or strategy level or at an actual project level. So just as an example, for the master plans, guidelines, and strategies, what was typically identified as being most useful would be an issues list. Essentially, allowing people to have all of the issues laid out in front of them so they understand which sorts of things need to be accommodated or not in that exercise as they move forward. The second stream, for existing and new projects and programs, this is actually a tool-based stream of activities with this climate lens process that ended up taking our original tool that we created with a set of climate mitigation and adaptation questions, and morphing that and customizing that into something that's specifically fit into the service area. So we kept the same format of having those sets of questions on adaptation and mitigation and asking the user to summarize their findings from both, and also identify potential opportunities for improvement. So that was that stream of tools. The other 3 streams sort of shook out, I guess you could say, through conversations as we went on through development of the process. Third of which being the quick assessment of existing operations. We really wanted to compartmentalize some of the things that were very consistent across the organization. So things like paper usage, electricity usage through lighting and keeping lights turned off and that sort of thing, and employee commuting. So we really wanted to tease those things out. So we've got a specific tool that is used across the corporation to address just those items, which really allows the users to focus on those first 2 streams when you're talking about impacts. You kind of can compartmentalize that. And those are some of the important things, but in many cases, actions to address paper usage and employee commuting are some low-hanging fruit items that had already been taken care of in many places. So we didn't want people to get distracted. And then the 4th stream, speaking specifically about budgeting, both with the annual budget updates and the multi-year budgets. This stream, we really wanted it to be led by our finance group. These are the folks that everybody turns to for advice and for approval. And so that stream is actually being led by them. And I'll chat a little bit more about that in a subsequent slide here. And then the 5th stream was a little bit of a catch-all, but also quite important in and of itself, and it's building climate change capacity. So within this stream, we include things like, developing a training program for onboarding staff so that they understand what kind of climate impacts or climate aspects are involved in the work that they're joining, but then also setting the stage for cross work group collaboration and really building that climate change capacity throughout the organization. That was the focus of that stream. So I mentioned that we put together documentation for everyone. So primarily, it was the form of an implementation guide. So within that implementation guide, we covered sort of the climate lens process in general, in terms of its objectives, so that the reader has a good framing for how this thing is applied to the entire corporation, sort of giving that context of how it is applying in the specific work area, but also that it's part of a larger effort. Documenting the development process briefly, putting together an issues table for the specific work area as well. So that implementation guide right up front has climate emergency issues list for that specific work area. And then subsequent to that, we include details on each one of those 5 streams. So exactly what the subjects for screening would be in each one of those streams, when to utilize the process and tools on those items in each of those streams. And then we also had a sort of a catch-up section to talk about that up-to-speed review of active programs. And that's more in line with satisfying the objectives of that November report, just to kind of get that snapshot. Ultimately, when documents or processes or guidelines are coming up for review, that's when they're triggered to use this process. But we wanted to make sure that we had a list of things that we can sort of check off over the next months to make sure that we get up to speed. And then ultimately included in that document as well is an administrative requirements section. So that's where we talk about review and sign off and who the champion within that work area is going to be for the implementation of this tool, as well as details on what kind of record keeping and communication should be expected. And then ultimately, as this process is being implemented, Climate Emergency Resource Team, which is the team that I'm a part of, we're going to be heading out and having meetings with the champions in each of the different service areas. We're aiming for twice per year here, just to make sure we touch base, look for opportunities for continuous improvement, but also opportunities to share learnings across the different work groups And that sort of really feeds into that fifth stream of activities around building climate change capacity. And then in addition to, we've got a guide for further analysis, because the intention of the tool is still not to cover absolutely everything, but to have the discussions and have the appropriate information elevated to the decision-making tables in each case. So a little bit about the process in use. So like I did mention, we are not entirely completed in terms of implementing this everywhere. We've primarily had those initial discussions, the workshop, and we're in that document creation and review stage with most work groups. There are a few that we've gone right forward with and implemented the process, one of which being our waste management programs and projects. So back in August, we took 2 reports to council, very different themed reports, but we wanted to sort of show the versatility of this process in terms of what it can actually do for the different work areas. So this first report, and this is accessible on the website at London, I can send some links around after, but we essentially took this report to council that explained how all 5 streams of the climate lens process were being implemented within our waste management programs and projects. It was a great exercise to do for the staff after having developed it, to just go and actually implement it on everything and say, okay, here we go. We've got some specific things we want to do that come out of this tool's use. And specifically, those were, applying the customized tool development to our long-term resource recovery plan and our residual waste disposal plan as well. But through this exercise, we also identified, which is helpful, that there was already a high level of greenhouse gas emissions knowledge being used as part of planning and execution of projects within waste management. So this was a great sort of, I call it like a 10,000-foot view of what the tool could be doing in each different work area. And we wanted to clearly articulate that for council. And the second report that went on that same day was the report completed by our colleagues over in transportation planning and design. So we had worked closely with them in the early stages of development of the tool and the process. And they ended up taking the customized tool for projects and programs, applying that to 12 current roads projects. And that spanned things from sort of your classic adding lanes to a road, so road widening, at-grade separations, roundabouts, improvements for transit and active transit and public transit infrastructure. So a wide swath of things that group produces. So they did that evaluation, and they took the results and prepared some recommendations for council. One of which being that a rather high-profile project in the city here, that being the widening of Wonderland Road, which is a main north-south thoroughfare on the west end of the town, for those who are not familiar with London. They recommended that we actually halt an EA that was in progress to take that road from 4 to 6 lanes. And that was, I mean, the results of this of the recommendations in this report did come from the climate emergency evaluations process. So it was quite interesting. It caught a lot of media attention. This project had been on the books for quite some time through a few different councils. Has a sticker price of about $212 million. And council ended up deciding to suspend the environmental assessment for that particular road widening project. And it's interesting to note too that the discussion that was spawned by the climate assessment of these projects really went far beyond the greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation requirements of projects, and actually got into topics of equity and affordability, and sort of shifting a focus from moving cars to moving people. So it was a very, very interesting discussion. I think it was probably about 90 minutes before they actually voted on the particular item. But we were certainly happy to see the discussion that it generated. And so there's some other examples that I can share on the process in action. Now, many of these upcoming here are not actually the result of a fully fleshed out and implemented process, but they identify that the work that we're doing in the background and having this education and culture shift as part of the effort is really coming through even before the actual process is fully instated. So we work pretty closely with our finance staff, as I mentioned, to come up with the 4th stream of activities and how we're going to manage the annual budgeting process and our multi-year budget process when it comes to climate change impacts. And like I said, although we haven't quite formalized the entire process with finance, it was very encouraging to see that this sort of language was coming out from the operating and capital budget development guidelines, which get issued every year. So within that document, they stipulated that budget amendment requests and our assessment growth business cases are going to be required to provide additional information pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks that are associated with that specific project. And of course, the target here is that with our next multi-year budget to have a climate lens process applied entirely to the entire budget. The other very encouraging thing that came out of this document was that our finance staff acknowledged that exploring the implementation of a carbon budget to parallel the city's financial operating and capital budgets is a long-term objective. So by initiating and integrating those climate emergency issues into the budgeting process now, the intent is to identify those needs, so both in staff, technical data, and expertise, as well as the processes for emissions and climate risk management that will best integrate with the existing system used to manage our city finances. And I know there's a lot of municipalities out there that I think are a few steps ahead of the City of London when it comes to incorporating carbon budgets and climate and carbon accounting frameworks within city operations. So I'd love to hear a bit about that afterwards as well. And another example here comes out of our planning group, and similar to our finance team, the climate lens process hasn't actually been fully finalized within our planning and development group. We've got some lofty goals that are actually embedded within the London plan, our official plan, around sustainable development that we're currently exploring how best to implement. But really encouraging to see that our early discussions increased awareness of the importance of climate change and addressing it. And this example is, again, not a result of the application of the process, but more of I think, an indicator on how it's really shifting things in the right direction. And in a nutshell, basically, we've got a piece of property in the northwest corner of our city, which is just barely within our urban growth boundary, which was originally earmarked as a cemetery. And upon further assessment, the groundwater table was actually a little bit too high, so it was not appropriate to be a cemetery. And the owners were looking to have it rezoned into our neighborhood place type so that they could develop 350 homes as a new subdivision. And when this application came forward to our Planning and Environment Committee, it was identified by our Director of Development Services that, with a climate emergency declaration, we need to rethink growth and make sure that we're doing it right. And so, where perhaps in another day this would have gone through for approval, especially in a housing crisis setting, it was actually recommended that this property or the rezoning of this property be held off until some secondary planning could be completed for this area to really identify the importance of capturing a new way of thinking with our growth. So that was very interesting. And there's a bit of a storied history with this property and some other things that have happened, but I'll leave it there for now. So looking ahead, we've got a number of things rolling right now, including some other examples of projects that are currently under review with the climate lens process. And these are things like our wastewater treatment master plan, our biosolids management master plan, actually our corporate master accommodation plan. We're talking about climate change as part of that. And we're also looking at how we're going to ingrain the climate considerations within our development charges study, our design specifications and requirements manual, and also some bylaw reviews that are happening right now are really generating some good conversations around climate change and integrating these concepts there as well. But ultimately, looking forward, we're looking for this to be a driver of continued organizational shift towards climate action and sustainability. This process is going to be a key element of our forthcoming climate emergency action plan, which will be enabling corporate climate action identification and prioritization as part of that effort. And it's also, and this is really one of the big ones, it's enabling a transparent and consistent communication of our climate change risks and opportunities to council. Part of the real execution of this is that we want to see every one of our standing committee and council reports include a section that addresses climate change. Now, mind you, there will be some that don't have a section in there specifically, as not absolutely everything that council decides on has a climate change impact, but we want to make sure that we're capturing those decisions that do have an impact. And the other thing that's really interesting on the transparency and consistency side of things is from the staff that we really developed this process with, there was a lot of goodwill generated by the fact that having a process like this allows any of the staff members who are evaluating projects and taking them out to the public for review or for engagement and input, when asked the question, have you accounted for climate change as part of a design or part of the program or project that you're having us talk about, they can very easily point to this process and say, yes, we have. And if you'd like more details, here you go. This is exactly what we're doing. So I think that provides a lot of comfort for people in a day and age now where we're having a lot of questions asked about how we're accommodating climate change in our work. So having this process to lean on is something that has really helped staff. And those last two bullets there, we're looking at daylighting interrelationships and dependencies, sort of connecting the dots, if you will, for climate action across our city services and work groups. So identifying systemic hurdles and presenting solutions to those things is something that I'm quite excited about seeing as a result of this particular effort. And then again, ultimately focusing on enterprise-wide opportunities and understanding, and really breaking down the silos and connecting the dots between issues and areas that we can make progress on and make better climate decisions. So with that, I'm happy to pass the floor back to Gabby if we want to have a conversation here about these things.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate that. And it's great to see all the progress that has been made in the City of London on this front. I'll probably ask a question that I know a lot of folks are are asking inside their minds, but is it possible to be able to share the resources and examples from the council meetings in the City of London where these discussions have taken place, and also like the workshop structure that you use to engage with your departments? Is that something that would be available to share with other municipalities?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
there's quite a lot of stuff out there already. We've got about 3 different reports that went forward that documented different bits and pieces of this process, which we can provide links to, and folks can look that up this afternoon if they like. And certainly, if those resources aren't sufficient, they're not answering the questions, I'm more than happy to continue to share additional pieces.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll just mention is we've been meaning to do this as well is we'll set up a climate lens hub that we can use to share resources and approaches that are being used in different municipalities. And so that's what create a one-stop shop where you can access it. We're still in the process of kind of like hunting out which are the municipalities that would, have developed resource and made some progress and undertaken some initiatives, and they had some lessons learned that they will be sharing with others. So just putting it out there that if you feel that your municipality's made enough progress that you'd be willing to kind of share some of the lessons learned that has occurred in your jurisdiction as you've been advancing this effort, please do just either send that in the chat, send me an email so that we could then kind of follow up and nag you and continue the sharings on that one. Perfect. So any questions that you'd like to ask for Mike just directly? And you can do it in a number of different ways. You can raise your question in the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can unmute and ask your question. So just in the first question that came in, Mike, is does the lens equally apply to EA stage identification of alternatives for council decisions? And if so, how? I'll start with that one. There's another part of it, but we'll get to that one after.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, the EA conversation is one that has sort of ebbed and flowed, because when we started the development of this tool, I think the general thoughts of most of the work areas and the staff and work areas that are doing EAs was that the EAs weren't really covering climate change adequately. So we had started off on the path of, okay, we're gonna treat this tool or whatever tool we create for that service area that's doing those EAs as something that they can use while they're in that EA process. And interestingly, as time went on, even just over a matter of months, we were getting comments back from ministries that were really identifying that there needed to be more. And so we're finding that from consultants that help us with EAs, we're getting a lot of this stuff embedded already. But we do have a backstop tool that's useful in various different work areas to address that EA option identification question. It is relatively high level. The intent is that the EA should dive deeper on all of these specific issues for any options that are being analyzed. But we do provide some guidance in a few of our different divisions tools that specifically spell out the EA stage and what to make sure you're looking at. I think that hopefully answers the question.
Okay, perfect. Let me just see. Okay, so like in terms of the waste reduction, if the waste reduction guideline kind of provides that narrative and explanation on how you handle, like with regards to landfill expansion, alternatives to methane flaring, actually capturing methane and making useful out of it, is it go into a lot of like not just the connection between waste and greenhouse gas emissions, but also on all the different various so whats of what are the mechanisms available to the municipality to address the GHG emissions from waste management, and how that relates to resiliency, like in terms of the narrative that it takes the London staff on.
Yeah, so I think, at its core, the tool itself is meant to help inform decision making. There's been a few instances, one with our transportation group, and then now with solid waste management, where there's been sort of additional thinking that's come at the end of that. So the tool itself is meant to highlight issues and to daylight issues related to whatever project or policy is being evaluated. In many ways, we do still need to rely on external expertise to get some of those specific options, whether it be looking at options evaluation for a specific project at the master planning stage. And that expertise still needs to come from both within and external, as it usually does in those projects. So by no means is the tool all encompassing. That was sort of one of the key moments or key tenets that we had up front. But we want to make sure that it's there to trigger the conversation, to at least ask the question, are you creating impacts, or do you have vulnerabilities as part of your thinking, your current thinking on this project? So the really key thing, I think, is having the identification of where this process is applied in existing processes. Because if you're triggering those conversations at the right point in time, you're able to alter the trajectory of the project ultimately. The waste management and sort of, the coupling of waste emissions and methane, options for dealing with landfill gas, that's a big conversation. And it's one that is already occurring here in London, and I'm sure elsewhere wherever we're managing landfills. And I think the tool provides information to identify the options, but ultimately to get down to sort of the life cycle assessment level of detail as part of options analysis. That is going beyond the extent of this specific tool that we've developed.
But in many ways, this kind of conversation enables the council to call for that next stage, which would be in the inevitable direction on terms of a feasibility analysis on different options. So I'm guessing that's like really one of the benefits associated with it, is no longer is it just like, those considerations are not brought into it, and status quo decision making continues. But now there's an opportunity for council to provide the resources and the council direction for the analysis of different options or feasibility studies to be undertaken, to come back to council to determine those more specific, detailed next steps.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really leans on, like I said earlier, the expertise that from the London context, the expertise that we have in-house already. A lot of these conversations have been happening in the background and as part of projects. And in many ways, this process just formalizes that and creates a place where, we're having this conversation. It's happening right here, as opposed to, perhaps it maybe being missed or not emphasized in the conversations as part of program or project development. Now it's being formalized, so it's right up front.
Perfect. And I just wanted to also give a shout out to Lisa. Thank you. She just mentioned that the city of Calgary would be interested in sharing their work to date on a climate lens development and learning from other municipalities. So thank you very much for that, Lisa. I will be following up with you. Was there any involvement in terms of the citizen groups in the process? Is it like in terms of the climate lens, or was it pretty much in-house development that took place?
Yeah, so it was mostly in-house. We did a little bit of external with CCAP and CAP to kind of get feelers and get some early opinions on the first iteration of the tool, but it was primarily done in-house. And excuse me, that's not just the team that I was working with. Like I said, all of the different work groups that we were touching had some instrumental input onto the development of the process, not just for their sort of customized piece of it, but how the entire process could work. So it was a huge team effort across the corporation. But yeah, I mean, in terms of community involvement, it was limited because we were focusing specifically on that corporate side of things.
And then in regards to the climate emergency plan development, there would have been community involvement in that process. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, yes, yep. And we actually had a prolonged engagement period to try and accommodate the restrictions with COVID and not being able to gather in person. But yes, absolutely. Our climate emergency action plan, we tried to go above and beyond to try and get out to people and engage on different climate change issues that they're concerned with and some of the solutions that folks are already pursuing, but also would be very interested to pursue in the months and years to come. So engagement is key, and that conversation is not going to stop either. I mean, it's a 30-year journey that we're getting on to get to net zero by 2050. And by no means do we think we've got it all, latched and battened down, and we know our exact plan right now. It's going to be an iterative approach for sure. And I think most municipalities probably see the value in that.
Perfect. And then there's another question with regards to the kind of the connection between the decision making. The goal on the climate lens isn't, as you were mentioning, like it's not saying like yes, no, it's a matter of bringing that climate change literacy and connection and understanding to council to help them inform and make educated decisions moving forward. It doesn't mean that, unfortunately, like we all know that it doesn't mean that, the climate poor decision making will not occur or climate implications decisions will not occur. It's more about kind of ensuring that connection takes place between the council understanding the implications and then ultimately making the final decision and having an open, transparent, democratic process associated with it. Is that kind of the thinking in London?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, we recognize that decisions are made by council, and that's where the buck stops. We want to make sure that they just have all of the information that they need to understand the full extent and the full impact of those decisions. That was by and large the purpose of the tool exercise. And of course, on the back end of that, you've got the education and improving everyone's knowledge on the staff side, so that as projects are being developed, they can be steered in a certain direction. But yeah, absolutely decision support as opposed to decision making.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. I'm just looking to kind of go through some other the questions. Actually, one of the things that's really interesting, based on one of the things that was a surprise to you that came from the council discussions that the discussions relating to the climate lens application in municipal councils, what was some of the kind of conversations that surprised you or kind of impressed you in terms of the level of knowledge or discussion that's bringing climate kind of implications into council decisions? Prior, comparison to previous council discussions where these climate implications may not have been as well understood versus as this climate lens takes place, what are the difference in conversations that you see taking place in council?
Great question. And I don't want to speak too much on behalf of council because but my impression at least, and I'm relatively new in the municipal sphere. I should qualify that too. I've only been at the City of London for about 2 years now, but I think one of the biggest changes that has occurred is just the realization that climate change is permeating just about every issue that we're dealing with. Particularly when it came to the transportation debate, I think the acknowledgement of the disproportionate impact of climate change on some of the equity deserving groups, I think was a big piece that came out of that conversation. And the direction that ends up taking council and the direction to our staff is that we need to start thinking about moving people as opposed to just moving cars. And really the equity part is so strong there, whereby if you're building infrastructure for moving people in cars, that means you're alienating folks who can't afford a car. Right, you're alienating folks who would prefer to take transit or active transportation. So I think the narrative around that whole conversation has really changed, and that's due in large part because of the climate situation. That's the one that comes to mind anyway.
Perfect, no problem. So one of the questions I'm actually just wanted to, Juliet, I was wondering if you can actually do me a favor. Can you check and see if you can run the polls just while this webinar is taking place? Just let me know if you can run it, because it's telling me I can't run the polls.
I've launched the poll. I've launched the polls, Gabby.
Okay, and can you share the screen so we can see the results as they're coming in, as they?
Sure. I'm just waiting for participants to complete. We have 63% participating at the moment.
Okay, perfect. So we're just going to run a couple of series of polls just to get a little sense from the folks on the call, just to get some feedback on where your thinking is at present and what would be of value to you moving forward. So we have a couple of them just to run some polls.
Okay, so I'm going to share the polls now.
Thanks, Juliet.
I'm sharing at the moment.
I don't see it.
Okay. 60% of the people say they found this very
If you could
useful.
just share your screen, that should bring it up actually. See if that works.
I don't know about
Usually
others, but I can see it fine.
Oh, you can.
I'm
Okay,
seeing the results
perfect.
too.
Okay, perfect. For some reason, I can't see it, but oh well, who knows with this. So Juliet, if you can kind of give summaries of, if you're able to see it, can you give summaries to the folks on the call?
Yeah, sure. 60% of the people found this very useful, 34% somewhat useful, and 6% useful, but still trying to figure out how to apply this in their jurisdiction.
Perfect, thanks. And if you can launch the other ones as well.
Okay. Launched. Oh, for some reason it's failed to start this one.
You know what? Sometimes I get so frustrated with Zoom. Speaking, another question I wanted to ask for folks as we're going through, yeah, I don't understand why I can't see it. It's annoying. But one of the other questions I did want to also ask for folks is let me just pull up and see if I can share it with this one, since there's some problems that we're having. Here we go.
I might actually be able to launch it here, Gabby.
Okay, try and see if you can. I don't know why it's causing me such problems.
You want to just launch the next few polls that are in here?
Sure, yes, please.
Yeah, let me see if this works. Oh, it says there's none started already. Failed to start poll. Another poll has started, or there's a shared error. So I'm not sure if anybody can see a poll now. But...
Damn. Does it? If folks can let me know if you guys see the poll now. Just raise your thumb or something if the poll is out there.
Looks like no.
I can't see from my end. So.
Okay. So one of the questions that I'm gonna kind of go in and try and I'll risk, actually, this is silly Zoom. I don't know why it's doing this. Gotta fix this problem. Okay. Now, so one of the questions we wanted to ask, if you can probably just kind of maybe add it into the chat box, one of the questions we wanted to find out is how many other municipalities have a climate implication section in their council report thus far? So if you have one that's already in your jurisdiction, if you have one, if you could just raise your hand, if you have a climate implications consideration section in your council report, and then we can track it that way. Yeah, I'm going to send it as a survey after the meeting. I don't know why. Just frustrating for why. All right, perfect. Excellent. Perfect, thank you. All right, and I will be sending this poll, but this is another question. So then the next question is, one of the questions that we wanted to kind of figure out from folks is it possible for, do you think that there would be, are people ready in terms of where their thinking is on setting up a community of practice that would work collectively across the jurisdictions? We have a very similar to a community of practice like for corporate energy managers, but it's kind of like a group network that would then kind of share resources, develop resources collectively. If people think that there is interest in that, or if this is the right time to start that community of practice. But what it would mean is that working collectively and sharing resources that are developed in one jurisdiction, testing out its transferability to other jurisdictions, kind of creating a hub where people can crib and steal and add into resources. That's one of the areas that we thought, if wondering if people think this is the right time. We did kind of raise this with a number of folks last year, but I think COVID kind of like created a bit of a delay in the climate lens development, but that seems to be changing now. And I know a number of jurisdictions and staff are really putting this high on their priority list. So that's another area that we were interested in gathering feedback from people. Go ahead, Huda. I see your hand
So I
up.
was just saying, yes, I would love that.
Okay.
In agreement.
All right. Yeah, so that's one of the areas that I was kind of thinking about, that what we're going to do as part of this, because of the silly polls not working on Zoom sometimes, and I don't know why, it just keeps telling me that I'm already logged in and it's active and I can't run it. So one of the things that we're going to be doing on this is putting out a survey to you, collecting some feedback from you in a survey that works. And then from there, kind of setting up people to sign up for it. That could be formed as like the initial cohort. It doesn't mean that we won't be sharing that work that's being developed from the community of practice with the larger network. We will. It's just a matter that we think we didn't want to kind of bringing people together all like to create a little bit more of a working group that would then advance this and share that with the larger collective. So that's one of the areas that we're thinking of thus far. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out this as a survey with gathering your feedback from your jurisdiction via through the email that I send out with this. But I'm sorry that the polls aren't working to be able to collect your feedback just as now. I don't know why they're frustrating. Okay, so I wanted to thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to provide this sharing and for leading. Like it's really great to kind of test it out and gather intel from municipal staff who aren't climate change experts to help us understand how they're wrapping their heads around these types of decisions as well. Because it's not an easy thing to kind of bringing those kind of implications. How will this decision affect climate or be affected by climate? And people, and it's hard enough for us in the climate change field to build all those kind of systemic connections, much less, you know, a person whose climate is not their background and they're trying to make sense of it. So I really want to thank you so much for advancing this effort in London and for taking the time to share how you're bringing how that's taking place in London with other municipalities. And I just a heads up to folks that we will be putting out the NAG to other jurisdictions to finding out where they're at. So I did want to kind of highlight if there's others who would like to kind of give a little heads up on a roundtable for where they're at in their jurisdiction and what they may be able to share with the collective. If you could just unmute yourself and add into that add that into the conversation now, that would be great. Any folks?
While everybody is mustering up the courage to unmute here, I just put my email address in the comment box. I know there's a bunch of other questions it looks like we didn't
Oh,
quite
sorry,
get to.
I didn't realize I was going to that. So let's see if we can.
Oh, just wanted to say, feel free to shoot me a line. I'm more
Okay.
than happy to share and answer further questions by email later.
Okay, perfect. Oh, one we didn't actually get into it, asset management and its connection to this in the process. That's a really important question because it is it's far-reaching in terms of the webs being brought together. Can you just speak to that a little bit in terms of asset management and how London's approaching the climate lens application to its asset management thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bit of an outlier only because the process of sort of revamping the corporate asset management plan and the background data that we're using to formulate that plan was sort of mid-stride as we started to get down the road of developing this climate lens process. But we have been closely working with the manager of our the folks that are doing that work to establish the process by which they're going to be incorporating climate risks into the valuation of assets. And sort of going through and allocating funds for that 10-year operating and capital budget. And one of the biggest conversations we're having right now is around, this idea of replacing like for like, and that has sort of, classically been the tool that you use to build that forecasted budget. What we really want to do, and we're just sort of in the early days of this, is, once we've gone through and we've established the baseline for our corporate asset management data infrastructure, we go in and we feed in those specific climate risks to tweak things so that we understand where the real vulnerabilities and opportunities are. Then we're going to sort of flip it on its end just a little bit and look for those opportunities where we can combine some of the expected capital expenditures for life cycle replacement and try, and this is a little bit conceptual still, but try to group those in ways that we can actually make much better progress on reaching our net zero goal from our assets, from our existing sort of engineered assets, as opposed to just tackling, like a roof membrane, and then 2 years later you're doing HVAC. Coordinating that conversation around getting to a net zero building at the end is one that we're eyeball deep in that conversation with our asset managers right now.
Perfect.
So it's a process, and I'll be happy to provide updates, in the next year or so when we've got a clearer path. But yeah, it's absolutely critical.
Sounds great. Perfect. Thank you. I should also mention that the question in regards to asset management, net zero targets, facilities really came up in our corporate energy managers workshop that we had last week, really focusing in on the role corporate green development standards and net zero targets need to play in helping to ensure that the facility and the corporate energy plans and asset management plans work in coordination to set up the roadmap for going from where we are right now to where we need to be in net zero by what date. And how that was one of the key questions that really came up in terms of integrating the corporate energy plan with asset management plans and looking 5 years ahead into the opportunities and setting up that roadmap with facilities and asset management folks to bring in those net zero targets. But that, I think, really one of the things that really came forward in that discussion from last week is the important role that corporate energy, corporate green standards, like what kind of standards will we put to new buildings? What kind of standards are going to be put to retrofits? And that direction coming from council as the climate emergency declarations and how it fits into the corporate energy plans and the asset management plans really helps that conversation, because it takes it away from a lot of the kind of traditional replacement, like for like replacement and payback and lowest cost options that kind of plague energy projects with procurement rules and all of that. Because I think that's one of the things that really came out from the conversation is that discussion on corporate energy and the targets that the municipality is setting for itself and being consistent with the climate emergency declarations and community target set is really important, because that drives the conversation with asset management and overall procurement decision making moving forward. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as one of the discussions. Darman?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to add and share that with the group. Great presentation, Mike. I'm the Senior Manager of Climate Change and Asset Manager for the town of Halton Hills. And what we've done, it's really good to see this climate lens process. What we've done at the town is we just, like Gabby, you were saying about the corporate energy management, we just transform our corporate energy management team into a climate change implementation team. Looking at 3 layers, not only from energy saving, but also from a greenhouse gas reduction and also from an adaptation perspective. So we put together a cross-functional team, procurement involved as well, planning, everybody across the town, every department, and we kind of first provided an update of what we're trying to do. and putting in place now the criteria for, because we have already in place a need assessment from asset management that go through us, the initiation of the project, and we also have council report having climate change. So we are kind of filling that gap in the middle, what the process will look like and how we're going to track the impact of climate change. So that's really good to see at City of London. That's really good. We'll keep in touch for sure.
Oh, absolutely. That
Perfect.
sounds
Thanks
great.
so much, Darn.
Thanks.
Excellent. And I will be probably following up with you in the near future to get some sharings from Halton Hills as well. Thank you. Brian?
So I can follow Darman. I'm with the City of Brampton. Brampton Council back in 2019 also declared a climate emergency. Staff followed up with what is called the Community Energy and Emissions Reduction Program. Sets out emissions targets and the tools for us to achieve those targets. We're at the stage now where we're beginning to put those tools forward in things such as our updated official plan and our forthcoming updated transportation master plan. Haven't yet prepared a tool such as my London has done, but to my understanding, it is planned for and should be coming fairly shortly.
Perfect. Then I will put you on the list to reach out to in the near future, Brian. Thank you.
Works for me, thanks.
All right, thanks. All right, perfect. Thank you. And Lisa, I will most definitely follow up with you on getting some sharings from the City of Calgary. I really appreciate that. So I will be reaching out to you very shortly. Mike, thank you so much for all of the taking the time to share with share all the kind of the process that the City of London has been using to advance its climate lens discussion, and how you've been working with all the different departments, and then how it actually kind of gets implemented at the the council level, and the discussions that are taking place there, and the changes in the discussion, and this is an education opportunity on climate change literacy and how these different decisions actually impact or get impacted by climate, and how this advances that climate literacy in council decision making. So thank you so much for taking the time to share the progress and the resources that London has developed thus far. We will be creating, starting the hub for the climate lens sharing. I'm going to send you out the survey that I couldn't get to work here, and then also gathering some more intel from you on those who would like to be part of a community of practice. We'll start out with initial group and then build it on from there. So again, thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to share. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. Hope you have a great Monday afternoon. And we'll be getting this out to you, getting out the proceedings from this webinar probably by tomorrow. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.